General Joseph Dunford testified before the Senate Armed Services Committee on his nomination to serve a second term as chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Topics included his assessments of ongoing threats to the U.S. and global security, including the actions and postures of Russia, North Korea, China, Iran, and Syria. This hearing is 2.5 hours.
I ask the committee to consider a list of 3,196 pending military nominations. All of these nominations have been before the committee the required length of time. Is there a motion to favorably report these 3,196 military nominations to the Senate?
So moved.
Is there a second? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
The motion carries. The committee meets this morning to consider the nomination of General Joseph Dunford for reappointment as chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. General Dunford, this committee thanks you for your decades of distinguished service to our nation. We are grateful to your wife, Ellen, for the support that she has always provided to you and to all who serve our nation in uniform. I'd also like to welcome your son, Patrick. Fortunately, you look like your mother, Patrick. Thank you. Who is joining us this morning. I know that your other children, Joe and Kathleen, send their support from afar, even as I bet they are a little relieved that they do not have to sit through your interrogation. In order to exercise its legislative and oversight responsibilities, it's important that this committee and other appropriate committees of the Congress are able to receive testimony, briefings, and other communications of information. Have you adhered to applicable laws and regulations governing conflicts of interest?
I have, Chairman.
Do you agree when asked to give your personal views, even if those views differ from the administration in power?
I do, Chairman.
Have you assumed any duties or undertaken any actions which would appear to presume the outcome of the confirmation process?
I have not, Chairman.
Will you ensure your staff complies with deadlines established for requested communications, including questions for the record in hearings?
I will, Chairman.
Will you cooperate in providing witnesses and briefers in response to congressional requests?
Yes, Chairman.
Will those witnesses be protected from reprisal for their testimony or briefings?
They will be, Chairman.
Do you agree, if confirmed, to appear and testify upon request before this committee?
I do, Chairman.
Do you agree to provide documents, including the copies of electronic forms of communication, in a timely manner when requested by a duly constituted committee, or to consult with the committee regarding the basis for any good faith delay or denial in providing such documents?
I do, Chairman.
And my colleagues and I are aware that that is a routine, but given the political environment today, especially, and certainly not any reflection on you, General Dunford, but those questions need to be asked. And I thank you for your responses. General Dunford, my colleagues and I will have a lot of questions for you about the many pressing national security challenges we face, but this hearing also offers an opportunity to reflect on some broader topics that have historically and more recently been a major focus of this committee's efforts: the unique role of the chairman in our national security structure and the state of civil-military relations. As, quote, principal military advisor to the President, the National Security Council, the Secretary of Defense, and the Congress, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff is the most important military duty in our nation. The chairman is the one military officer with the authority to present comprehensive analysis and advice to civilian policy makers, informed by all the military services and combatant commands, and spanning every global and functional issue of national security. This responsibility is now more important than ever. Our country faces a multitude of national security challenges, all of which cut across the regional and functional organizations that divide up the Department of Defense. The chairman is the only military officer with a truly comprehensive perspective on the joint force, on all the threats we face worldwide, and the interplay between them. That is why this committee acted last year to clarify the chairman's statutory responsibility to advise civilian leaders on the global strategic integration of our military efforts. The chairman's unique role lends extra gravity to the responsibility that you and every military officer possesses, the responsibility to provide best military advice to civilian leaders. This is not a luxury, it is a duty. It is a duty that military officers owe to the American people and to the men and women under their command. Civilian policymakers in both the executive and legislative branches rely on our military professionals to better understand the military dimensions of the national security challenges we face and the options at our disposal for wielding military power effectively. But best military advice does not stop there. Military officers, and especially the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, must tell their civilian superiors what action they believe are best and right to take, and they must do so honestly, candidly, respectfully, but forcefully, whether civilians want to hear it or not. Best military advice may be disregarded, but it must always be given. What's more, in my opinion, best military advice should not be narrowly limited to technical military matters. When the chairman offers his best military advice, he's not simply offering the best advice about the military, but rather the best advice from the military. And that extends to issues of national security policy, strategy, and operations. For example, the decision to take our nation to war properly rests with civilians. It's a policy question, but military officers should not be prohibited from voicing their advice on such a matter. Indeed, it is their duty to do so. If you haven't seen Mr. Burns' series on Vietnam, I suggest that you pay attention to it, and I suggest that you examine the tensions that existed between the civilian superiors and the military. And I believe that you will come to the conclusion that the military advice was not given the weight and effect that it should have, which was one of the factors in leading to 58,000 names on the wall in granite not too far from here. Just as we are clear about what constitutes best military advice, we must be equally clear about its limitation. Advice is just that, advice. The chairman as principal military advisor is not in the chain of command. Ours is not a general staff system. In our system, operational command rests with combatant commanders who report by law to the Secretary of Defense. The chairman must also advise civilian leaders on the military dimensions of strategy, operations, and plans, both within and among our combatant commander's area of responsibility, and it is his right, indeed his responsibility, to provide competing advice to policymakers when he disagrees with combatant commanders. But the chairman is not an operational commander. Similarly, best military advice does not mean independent advice. It occurs in the context of civil-military relations, and I want to say a few words on this in closing. Professor Elliott Cohen has described civil-military relations as an unequal dialogue. Civilian and military rules are not to be dichotomized and held apart. Rather, they must be brought together through an iterative process of discussing, scrutinizing, refining military strategy, operations, and plans, a process in which civilian leaders must play an active role and make the major decisions. Best military advice is central to this dialogue, but it can never replace it. Unfortunately, I sense that this civil-military dialogue has become strained. At times, civilian officials have disrespected military leaders, disregarded their advice on critical military matters, and shirked accountability for their decisions. More recently, civilian oversight and control of the military has morphed into meddling and micromanagement of tactical details for political purposes, which has harmed military effectiveness. The last administration distinguished itself in this regard. What we must guard against, General Dunford, especially now, when so many civilian leaders at the Department of Defense are either missing or are themselves recently retired military officers, is an overcorrection. We cannot afford to swing from civilian micromanagement to civilian marginalization. We need to restore balance in civil-military relations where best military advice is always rendered and received, but is done so as part of a dialogue with civilians who participate actively and have the last word on policy, strategy, operations, and plans. This committee takes its obligations seriously in this regard. The civil-military dialogue does not only occur within the Department of Defense, it occurs between the branches of government as well. That's why the chairman also serves as a principal military advisor to the Congress. And that's why, as part of the confirmation process, we ask current and future chairmen, like all military officers, to provide their best personal advice to this committee if asked. It is to ensure that the members of this committee and the full Congress are able to meet our independent constitutional responsibilities to the Americans we serve. At present, this committee and the Congress more broadly is not receiving the information and respect it deserves as a co-equal branch of government. We do not work for the president or the executive branch. We have distinct and equal responsibilities under the Constitution, and the administration needs to understand its obligation to the Congress in this regard. Too often, members of this committee are learning in the media for the first time about major national security and military activities that we, as the Committee of Oversight, should be told about and consulted on in advance. Even now, nearly 10 months into this year, we are told we have a new strategy for Afghanistan, but members of this committee have far more questions than answers. The administration must do better, and until it does, the Congress and this committee will be forced to use what levers we have to show the administration that we are not and will not be a rubber stamp. We will have many questions for you, General. We look forward to your candid, forthright, and best military advice. Senator Reid.
Oh, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I also want to welcome General Dunford this morning and thank you for his outstanding service to this nation over many years. General Dunford is joined by his wife Ellen and son Patrick. Thank you. And also like to acknowledge the General's other children, Joe and Kathleen, who are not able to join us today. And on behalf of our committee, we thank the entire Dunford family for their continued sacrifice and support. It means a great deal to us, but more particularly to the men and women of the armed forces. Thank you. Under the leadership of Chairman McCain, this committee has maintained a robust hearing schedule focused on the most pressing threats and challenges facing our armed forces. Our committee has heard from the most senior political leaders in the department, the highest echelons of the military, and distinguished outside experts. Time and again, these hearings have underscored that the United States is faced with a myriad of challenges that offer no quick or easy solutions and require adroit military leadership. During General Dunford's tenure as chairman, he has provided sound military counsel and demonstrated a deep understanding of the national security threats our nation must address. As chairman, General Dunford has made it a priority to keep this committee well informed on the department's policy decisions impacting our armed forces and changes to our military strategy to counter the risks posed by our adversaries. While this committee may not always agree with General Dunford's views, he has been honest and conducted himself with integrity. Therefore, I believe he should be reappointed to serve as the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. As we pause to consider the state of the world today, General Dunford's professionalism and commitment to duty have served him well. This is not the first time in our nation's history that we have had to confront multiple threats from abroad, but it is an incredibly dangerous and uncertain time. North Korea's nuclear missile program poses an immediate and grave national security threat, and heightened tensions on the peninsula are a deep cause for concern. The global order established by the United States following World War II is under siege by a revanchist Russia determined to reassert its influence around the world. China continues its saber-rattling in the Asia-Pacific region by undermining the freedom of navigation and using economic coercion of its smaller, more vulnerable neighbors. Iran continues their aggressive weapons development activities, including ballistic missile development efforts, as well as other destabilizing activities in the region. Finally, our military has been consumed by two prolonged wars against violent extremist groups like ISIS that has sapped readiness and precluded our military personnel from training for full-spectrum operations. As we grapple with these threats, we must also be mindful that our President continues to show a lack of in-depth knowledge or nuance in foreign policy and defense matters. It had been my sincere hope that the magnitude of the office, coupled with the enormous challenges we face, would have encouraged the President to be more judicious with his comments and thoughtful with his actions. Unfortunately, that has not been the case. To date, our foreign policy has been predicated on alienating longtime allies, discounting the value of international organizations and our global commitments, and retreating from our leadership role in the world. While at the same time, decisions on our defense posture and complicated military personnel issues are promulgated by presidential tweet. Such trends lend more uncertainty to already dangerous times, and I believe the risk of miscalculation and unintended consequences have never been higher. Resolute leadership at the highest echelons of our military is a necessity, now more than ever. I commend General Dunford for the steady hand he has demonstrated in guiding the Joint Chiefs during his tenure as chairman, and for the sterling example he has set for all those that wear the uniform. Thank you again, General Dunford, for your willingness to serve our nation. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
General Dunford, welcome.
Thank you, Chairman. Chairman McCain, Ranking Member Reed, distinguished members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today. I'm honored to be renominated as the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. I'd like to begin by thanking the committee for your support of our soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines. This year's National Defense Authorization Act is a reflection of your commitment to ensure that they remain the most well-trained, well-equipped, and capable military force in the world. Today, we have a competitive advantage over any adversary, and I can say with confidence that our armed forces are ready to protect the homeland and meet our alliance commitments. However, that advantage has eroded in recent years. If reconfirmed, I look forward to working together with the committee to ensure that the chairman testifying in 2025 has the same degree of confidence in our ability to provide for the common defense. This committee is keenly aware of today's complex and volatile security environment. Both the chairman and the ranking member have mentioned it, and I don't expect the strategic landscape to improve in the near future. Russia continues to invest in a full range of capabilities designed to limit our power projection, erode U.S. influence, and undermine the credibility of the NATO alliance. Similarly, China is focused on limiting our ability to project power and weakening our alliances in the Pacific. Iran is projecting malign influence across the Middle East, threatening freedom of navigation while supporting terrorist organizations in Syria, Iraq, and Yemen. And while we're all focused on the destabilizing threat posed by North Korea and Kim Jong-un's relentless pursuit of a nuclear intercontinental ballistic missile that can threaten the United States, we are also confronted by al-Qaeda, ISIS, and other trans-regional terrorist organizations. And while we've made significant progress against core ISIS in Iraq and Syria, we are not complacent, and much work remains to be done. In Afghanistan, we are beginning to deploy additional U.S. and coalition forces in support of the President's broader South Asia strategy. In the context of these and other challenges, we need a renewed focus to restore joint readiness and develop the warfighting capabilities we'll need to defend the nation in the future. As this committee has highlighted in hearings, we face very real and significant readiness challenges today, and we have failed to adequately invest in the future. I can't state it any clearer. If we don't address this dynamic with sustained, sufficient, and predictable funding over the course of several years, we will lose our qualitative and quantitative competitive advantage. In the end, this will have a profound effect on our ability to deter conflict and to respond effectively if deterrence fails. If reconfirmed, I'll commit to working with the administration and the Congress in addressing these challenges to ensure our men and women in uniform never find themselves in a fair fight. Chairman, I listened very carefully to your opening statement. I fully understand my responsibilities to provide candid best military advice to the President, the Secretary of Defense, and the National Security Council, and I'll be forthright when I'm asked to appear before this committee and other congressional venues. And with that, I'm prepared to answer your questions.
Well, thank you very much, General. In June, you testified without sustained, sufficient, and predictable funding, I assess that within 5 years, we will lose our ability to project power. We still don't have sustained, sufficient, and predictable funding, and as you mentioned, I'm not sure we will for the foreseeable future unless Congress finally steps up to do its job. As you know, we'll start fiscal year 2018 on a continuing resolution with no insight into what the final funding levels will be for the year. What's the effect of the average first lieutenant who's out there, captain, has a company command, and they don't have sufficient funds to carry out their training regimen, and their pilots are flying less hours per month than their Chinese and Russian counterparts. First of all, what effect does that have on our ability to defend the nation? And second of all, what does it do to the men and women of the all-volunteer force?
Chairman, I'll answer the first part. When you say what does it do to our ability to defend the nation, and when I in my opening remarks I mentioned competitive advantage, and we've done some very careful analysis about where are the current threats, and we use largely Russia and China to benchmark our capabilities. And if you go back to 1999 or 2000, we had what we should have as the United States of America, a nation that thinks and acts globally. We had a significant competitive advantage in our ability to project power when and where needed to advance our national interests. I can't say that today. We are challenged in our ability to project power both to Europe and in the Pacific as a result of those threats. And other nations, to include non-state actors as well, have capabilities on the high end that challenge our ability to project power. So over time, that has eroded. With regard to the question about lieutenants and captains, I think I have some insight into that in the sense that I was a platoon commander in the late 1970s, and I lived through a period of time when we weren't properly resourced, we didn't have sufficient money for training, we didn't have sufficient personnel, and many times the tasks that we were asked exceeded our capability. I think it has to do with the confidence, and I would give you an example of a pilot. If you look at a pilot specifically, you know, in the past, pilots might have had 30 hours a month to fly. Now they may be down as low as 15 hours a month. On a day-to-day basis, you may not be able to see the difference between pilot A and pilot B. But if there is an in-flight emergency, I can guarantee you that the pilot that has 30 hours will immediately feel much more comfortable and confident in their ability to deal with an anomalous situation, be able to control their physiological response. And you and I may never find out about that incident. On the contrary, if a pilot has 15 hours a month, we may very well find out about it because it's a Class A mishap.
And our non-combat casualties and fatalities are now higher than in operations than in combat.
Chairman, they are, and I would attribute that to two things. I mean, one, it's the material condition that does affect the numbers of hours that a pilot flies, a driver drives, so forth. It's also the size of the force relative to the requirements that we have. Going back to my lieutenant days, if you think about training, whether it's on a ship, in a plane, or in the infantry as a series of 101, 201, 301, 401 tasks, when I was a lieutenant, we didn't go to 201 until we were confident that we were well-founded in 101, and we didn't go to 301 until we were well-founded in 201. And I would argue that, well, we may have trained a standard in the past when we had sufficient time and resources. Now we're training to time because that ship is going to go to sea, that pilot is going to go to war, that infantryman is going to go to war, whether or not they've had an opportunity to retrain sometimes in the basic tasks or not.
Do you believe it's possible for the United States to achieve its national security objectives in Afghanistan as long as Pakistan provides support and sanctuary to groups such as the Taliban and the Haqqani Network?
I do not believe that we can attain our objectives in Afghanistan, Chairman, unless we materially change the behavior of Pakistan.
And have you got thoughts on how you do that?
Chairman, well, it will require a broad approach to do it. I think it's unacceptable that you hit the key issue. It's unacceptable that Pakistan provides sanctuary, and we ought to bring the full weight of the U.S. government and our coalition partners on Pakistan to ensure that they do not provide the sanctuary that they have provided historically to groups like Haqqani and the Taliban.
Are you satisfied now with the rules of engagement which have been changed with the new administration?
Chairman, I am, and I had a long conversation with General Nicholson in NATO over the weekend to ensure that he also had the same degree of confidence. Secretary Mattis has spoken to General Nicholson in the past week to make sure he's confident that he has the rules of engagement that allow him to engage any enemy that is a threat to the Afghan government, our mission, coalition forces, or U.S. personnel.
some of it reminiscent of our rules of engagement during the Vietnam conflict?
Well, Chairman, they may have been. I can assure you today that we have the rules of engagement necessary to advance our objectives in Afghanistan and to protect the force as well.
Thank you. Senator Reid.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, General Dunford. In response to the committee's pre-hearing policy questions, you indicated that Iran is adhering to its obligations under the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, of the JCPOA, but you do rightfully point out that they are engaged in extremely destabilizing activities in the region, missile development, activities that can't be tolerated. But going back to JCPOA, is it your view that it was designed to limit their nuclear capacity and that it is currently achieving that objective?
Senator, it was designed specifically to address what I would describe as one of the 5 major threats of Iran, the nuclear threat. As you point out, what the agreement didn't address was the missile threat, the maritime threat, Iran's support of proxies, and the cyber activity that they have conducted.
And they're still pursuing those other venues very aggressively, in your view?
They are, Senator, and we see a physical manifestation of that in Yemen. We see it in Iraq. We see it in Lebanon. We see it in Syria.
In this complicated world where there's so much going on, we have our focus on North Korea. If we were to step away from the JCPOA, would that have an effect, in your professional view, on the ability to negotiate or to come to some type of non-kinetic solution in Korea?
Senator, it makes sense to me that our holding up agreements that we have signed, unless there's a material breach, would have an impact on others' willingness to sign agreements.
And in terms of a force that we've all comment on is stretched, if in reaction to rejecting the JCPOA, would you assume that the Iranians would step up their activity even more, causing us to at least in a contingency have forces that would be in that area and not available for Korea?
Senator, I would. We watch every day, and this is even in addition to the JCPOA issue, just our relationship with Iran. We watch every day for indicators that either Iranian-backed militia forces or Iranian maritime forces would pose a threat to the force. We have postured the force to deal with those threats, and we watch the intelligence carefully to make sure our posture every day is in the context of the current threat.
You've said it, and the Secretary of Defense has said it, and the White House has said it too, is that our major effort against North Korea is diplomatic at this moment. Is that accurate?
Senator, it absolutely is. The military dimension today is in full support of the economic and diplomatic pressure campaign that Secretary of State is leading in North Korea.
One of the things that's difficult to comprehend is we do not have an ambassador in South Korea, do we?
We do not. We have a charge at this time, Senator.
And in effect, General Brooks is sort of doing double duty informally?
No, Senator, we're very proud of what General Brooks is doing right now as both he sits there at the nexus of the political military.
No, I'm very, as you have confidence in General Brooks, but if we're in a diplomatic mode, we don't have an ambassador until we don't also have an assistant secretary for the area in the State Department. We just don't seem to have the team in place to have an all-court press for a diplomatic solution. Is that unfair comment, or?
Senator, I certainly probably would comment not only because I have clearly heard Secretary Tillerson also comment on the difficulty he has right now doing all the things that the State Department's been called upon to do with some of the gaps that continue to exist.
In terms of the situation on the peninsula now, can you give us your judgment of where we are today, given the statements back and forth between leaders of both countries, given our aerial operations off the coast, given the response yesterday that could trigger a reaction by the North Koreans? Can you give us an assessment?
Senator, I can. While the political space is clearly very charged right now, we haven't seen a change in the posture of North Korean forces. We watched that very carefully. We clearly have postured our forces to respond in the event of a provocation or a conflict. We also have taken all the proper measures to protect our allies, the South Koreans, the Japanese, the force, as well as Americans in the area. But what we haven't seen is military activity that would be reflective of the charged political environment that you're describing.
Thank you very much, General.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. General Dunford, I'd like to pursue two things: one, intelligence, and the other, modernization. In doing this, I want to get three statements in the record. To begin with, on Sunday, Kim Jong-un released a propaganda video depicting the U.S. aircraft carrier and bomber being blown up by North Korean missiles. He further threatened that a U.S. attack would see our forces, as he said, head to the grave. I've been very proud of the uniforms coming out and talking about how real the threat is. General Hyten, the Strategic Command commander, said last week that he views North Korea's ability to deliver a nuclear weapon on an ICBM as a matter of when, not if. And Defense Intelligence Agency assesses that North Korea will be able to reliably range the U.S. mainland with nuclear ICBMs by the end of 2018. Well, I remember when that 2018 was 2020 and it was 2019. I'd have to ask you how confident you are in our intelligence community's ability to monitor and detect just where they are, and how accurate you believe that end of 2018 is.
Senator, from my review of the intelligence, I think that what General Hyten said and what you've just described reflects the collective judgment of the senior leadership in the department. And I think something that General Hyten said is something I've also said in public, is that whether it's 3 months or 6 months or 18 months, it is soon. And we ought to conduct ourselves as though it is just a matter of time, and a matter of very short time before North Korea has that capability.
Yeah, and I think it's important to get in the record. Name a couple of the unique challenges in getting intelligence on North Korea that don't exist in other places.
They may exist to some degree in other places. The North Koreans over time have buried much of their capability underground, which creates unique challenges. There's also some specific weather challenges in North Korea that limits our collection at various periods of time. And to be honest with you, Senator, part of it also has been the competing demand for a limited amount of intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. Certainly over the last 18 months, we have increased our collection against North Korea, but for a long period of time we had decreased our collection against North Korea because of competing demands elsewhere in the world. So I think those are probably three of the most significant challenges we face.
That's good. And I assume you're equally concerned about their activity in trading technology, missile technology with other countries such as Iran.
Senator, we are. We've looked at that nexus quite a bit. I'm not sure we've seen any transfer of nuclear technology, but we certainly have seen missile technology and a wide range of other weapon systems that they have exported, or expertise that they have exported outside of North Korea.
Okay, on modernization, both of the Army Generals Anderson and Murray said recently in our subcommittee, given the complex range of threats, the Army has a very short window to improve capability and capacity. Meanwhile, our adversaries are closing the capacity gap. I think you said, if I wrote it down correctly, you said if we don't have sustained funding, we'll lose our qualitative and quantitative advantage over our adversaries. I think that is accurate. And you've expressed your concern that we're getting very close on that. Is that correct?
I have, Senator, and I think this reflects both the Chinese, the Russians, and others have studied our strengths over the course now of 20 years. Yeah. They've been on a path of developing capabilities that exploit our vulnerabilities, and we know what those are, and we have a plan to correct those. But if we don't correct those, our ability to project power, for example, when the Army talks about it, our ability to project power into Europe, but then operate freely within Europe to include to support our forces with logistics bases, sustainment efforts, is going to be challenged.
And I think your statement, along with some of the other military, some of the uniforms, are helpful to us because the American people really don't understand the level of threat that's out there, the complexity of it, how it's not something that's happened before, and that we need to start prioritizing our military and our defense issues. One last thing, General Milley recently testified during the 18 Army posture hearing that we are now outranged and outgunned. Do you agree with that statement?
Relative to certain threats under certain conditions, I do, Senator.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Gillibrand.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, General Dunford, for your service. The uncertainty that's facing our transgender men and women in uniform since late July has been deeply unsettling to many members of the committee. Chairman McCain, Ranking Member Reed, Senator Susan Collins, and I have introduced a bipartisan bill that would prevent the Department of Defense from separating currently serving transgender individuals solely based on their gender identity. These men and women across all services and occupations were told by the Department of Defense that they would be allowed to serve openly and continue in their military careers. Many have worked diligently within their chains of command to meet every requirement put forth by the former administration. Now they have been plunged into a career of uncertainty, and their service and sacrifices have been unfairly tarnished. Many of us on the committee are deeply disturbed by the developments of the last few months. Do you agree that our thousands of openly serving transgender men and women have served their country with honor and valor?
I do, Senator. I would just probably say that I believe any individual who meets the physical and mental standards and is worldwide deployable and is currently serving should be afforded the opportunity to continue to serve.
Thank you. If reappointed, can you promise currently serving transgender individuals who have followed department policy and meet every requirement, as you just said, asked of them, that they will not be separated from the armed services based solely on their gender identity?
Senator, I can promise that that will be my advice. What I've just articulated is the advice I've provided in private and I've just provided in public.
Thank you. And have you had the opportunity to meet with any of the thousands of transgender individuals currently serving in uniform on active duty to hear how the recent developments have impacted their lives? And if not, will you commit to doing so?
I have not since I guess August when the announcement was made, but I would certainly do that, Senator.
Thank you. On the subject of military sexual violence, we've been at this for a while now. Every Secretary of Defense since Dick Cheney was Secretary of Defense have said zero tolerance for sexual assault in the military. But we still have serious issues of climate. Our assault rate is still 15,000 estimated assaults, sexual acts, and unwanted sexual contact. But we really aren't moving the needle in the way we should. During a hearing over the last few years, we had General Dempsey, who said in 2014, he said that we are currently on the clock, if you will. If we don't make serious progress in a year, we might have to look at legislation. Now, more than half of the Senate has voted twice to take the decision-making of whether a crime has been committed out of the chain of command and giving it to trained military prosecutors as a way to professionalize our military justice system. This is a reform that our allies have already done long ago, mostly for defendants' rights, whether it's the UK, whether it's Israel, whether it's Australia, Canada, Netherlands. And they've done it purposefully because they believed that if someone could be sent to jail for life, that the decision maker who makes those decisions should be well trained as a criminal prosecutor, have no biases, not know the perpetrator or the victim, the accused or the accuser, and have that criminal justice background so that they can leave biases at the door. We've done every type of reform that has been recommended by every panel that's been impaneled to look at this. We have special victims councils in place to give survivors more legal advice during the process. We have changed the rules of evidence to make them more similar to the civilian system so there's more protections. We have done literally anything anyone can think of that the Department of Defense will not oppose. We've made retaliation a crime 3 years in a row. Not one case has gone to court-martial of retaliation of the hundreds of cases I've looked at. The largest basis for each of the services, I look at all the sexual assault cases every year and do a broad-based review. So we're not fixing the problem. I would like a commitment from you that you will work with me on ways to fix this problem and to honestly look at this command structure. because more often than not, the decisions that are made aren't necessarily the right decisions. Using non-judicial punishment when going to court-martial is recommended by those who have done the investigation. Kicking somebody out who has many witnesses against them instead of taking them to court-martial. These are kinds of decisions that are not making our military stronger. So I would like your commitment that you will work with me on this issue this year to try to make a difference to solve this problem.
Senator, I don't think any of us are satisfied where we are, and I would commit to work with you to look at this issue.
Thank you.
General, let me just say that this committee has had hundreds of hours of hearings, input from leaders such as yourself. This issue has been thoroughly vetted by this committee. The Secretary of Defense is looking at this issue and others, and I am convinced that the one aspect of this issue that this chairman will not tolerate, and that is to undermine or cause the commanding officer not to have both authority and responsibility in this process. I just want to make that very clear to you, the position of the majority of this committee. We've got a lot of work to do on the issue, but to take away the commanding officer's authority and responsibility would be a violation of everything I've ever known about the United States Navy for 70 years.
Chairman, can I respond
Please.
to both you and Senator Gillibrand? I mean, I'm on record as having said, and I believe this, that we will not solve the problem unless commanding officers are singularly, personally accountable and responsible for command climate and for fixing the problem. What I answer to Senator Gillibrand, just to be clear and to be honest today, is to continue to look at the issue and find ways to address sexual assault. I was not referring to the chain of command not being responsible or accountable. My experience is similar to yours over the last 40 years, that any problem we have ever had inside of the organization has been solved when commanders were engaged, responsible, and accountable for solving that problem.
Well, I thank you for that statement, General, and we will continue to debate it. And there's a lot of work that needs to be done, as I think you'd be the first to acknowledge. But to say that commanding officers no longer have responsibility for the conduct of those under their command undermines about 200 and some years of military chain of command and responsibility. If commanding officers are not carrying out those responsibilities, then they should be, then their lack of assumption of responsibility that they should be held accountable to. But to take them out of the chain of responsibility, in my view, is a serious, serious mistake. Senator Fisher.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, General Dunford, for being here today and for your continued service. On July 4th and July 28th, North Korea tested a new missile now known as the KN-20. And based on the capabilities demonstrated in these tests, numerous press reports estimate that the missile has a potential range of over 10,000 miles, which would put much of the United States within its reach. And while I understand technical hurdles still remain before North Korea possess a reliable, accurate, and nuclear-capable ICBM system, what's your assessment of the ballistic missile threat to the homeland from North Korea? Where do you see that trend line moving?
Senator, I think for all planning purposes, capability development, we should assume now that North Korea has the capability. As you suggest, there are some technical elements of their program that haven't been fully tested, from a re-entry vehicle to some of the ability to stabilize a missile in flight. But I view all those as engineering solutions that will be developed over time. And frankly, I think we should assume today that North Korea has that capability and has the will to use that capability.
The last major modification of our homeland missile defenses came in 2013, when in response to an accelerating threat from North Korea, then Secretary Hagel announced plans to increase the number of interceptors from 30 to 44. And given what we've witnessed over the past year, do you believe that the current threat environment requires additional homeland missile defense capabilities?
I do, Senator, and over the last 7 or 8 weeks, we did a very detailed look at increasing ballistic missile defense capability for the North Korean threat, certainly, but for other threats as well. And we do think an increase is warranted. And I believe in the NDAA, and we certainly support that. There's an additional 21 interceptors that are in the NDAA that was just passed.
Right. And should the Department program additional resources towards ballistic missile defense across the FIDEP?
Senator, we should, and both the Congress and the President have directed us to do that, and we have. Thank you.
I'd like to follow up on some previous questions that I think we were trying to get to, what happens when operational demands aren't necessarily met. As you know, we conducted a hearing recently on the naval accidents that are happening in the Pacific, and we looked at the concern that the Navy is trying to do too much with too little. Demand's outpacing the supply. That's what we're seeing. And I don't think it's just focused on the Navy. I think there's concerns with other services as well. We know the Navy's doing its reviews, and I think those really focus on the supply side of the equation on that. Can you tell me if the Joint Staff is reviewing the operational demands that have been placed on the Navy, and have these incidents have an impact on the way that we are looking at how to assess a high op-tempo, how that poses a risk to our forces now?
Senator, we have reviewed that, and what we're making sure now is that readiness of the force, as well as our ability to respond to the unexpected, is a key element, even as we meet the requirements. You know, in the past, without going into a lot of detail, we had a bottom-up process for global force management, meaning each one of the commanders provided us with all their requirements, and then we kind of leveled across and met all those requirements. We have now implemented, and this year we'll implement it for the first time, a top-down process where we fence certain numbers of forces as a result of the services needing those forces to be back in the United States to generate readiness, or somewhere else located where they are generating readiness and not allocated, so we can continue to sustain the force. We realize that what we've been doing in the past is unsustainable moving forward. The demand does exceed the supply, and we need to make an adjustment to the demand as well as the supply, as you alluded to, Senator.
Do you anticipate reducing the demand?
I anticipate managing risk in a different way until we can grow the capacity to meet the demand. I do.
Does that put more of a threat on the readiness of our troops then? I mean, they're not just take the Navy. They're not just out there on ships doing operations with no strategy in place.
They are not, Senator, but what we have to do is get to the point where we have a balance between the time that units are at home station training, developing their capabilities, and the time they're deployed. If you talk about the Navy example, I was aboard the USS Barry some months ago. The USS Barry had been at sea 70% of the time in the previous 12 months. So when we go back now and we look at were they able to do all the training necessary and what was their life like during those 12 months, 70% of the time underway is an unsustainable rate, and so we're going to have to make adjustments in the demand that will incur managing operational and strategic risk, there's no doubt.
Thank you.
And it also include 100-hour work weeks?
Chairman, absolutely. And when sailors are at sea 70% of the time, they're at work most of every day.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. General Dunford, I want to thank you for your leadership, your continued service to our nation, and to your family. Thank you very much. I think you've done an extraordinary job, and we're privileged to have you in this position. In your written responses to the committee's questions in advance of this hearing, you addressed a few of my questions about improving mental health and suicide prevention services. You highlighted the growth in embedded mental health providers. The FY15 NDAA included a bipartisan provision called the Sexton Act that I authored with Senator Wicker. It requires every service member to get a confidential mental health assessment each year. In the past, you and the service chiefs have said that you believed it would be fully implemented no later than October 1 of this year, which is next week. General, are the services fully implementing the requirements for robust annual mental health assessments?
Senator, thank you. And as you know, I've worked that issue personally now for some years, and I appreciate your support in that area. The Army, the National Guard, several of our components are completely compliant, and they'll make the deadline. There are some outliers that haven't met the standard, and I was aware of that as I prepared for my testimony, so I can assure you that both the Secretary and I will be engaged in cleaning it up. I think the vast majority of the department has become compliant with the Sexton Act, but there are some outliers, and we'll get the full details to you. I became aware of that this week as we prepared for testimony.
Thank you. Can you describe your understanding of our strategy to counter North Korea and how you're working with your partners across interagency to execute that?
I can, Senator. And very briefly, when Secretary Tillerson came in last year, people told him that there were two things that he couldn't do anything about. One was that nuclear weapons were inextricably linked to survival of the regime in North Korea. They wouldn't trade away nuclear weapons. And the second is that China wouldn't cooperate. Secretary Tillerson is testing those two assumptions because the alternatives at the time to not testing those two assumptions were so dire. So we have now a pressurization campaign applying economic and diplomatic means primarily to force the North Koreans to denuclearize the peninsula. We are also working very closely with the Chinese. Secretary Tillerson has been almost relentless in dealing with the Chinese over the past few months to get them cooperate with the UN sanctions regime. On the positive side, there's been four UN resolutions passed this year, and I think the Chinese cooperation, to include the Russian cooperation in passing those sanctions, is unprecedented. We're at the phase now where implementation of the sanctions is going to determine whether or not we have a peaceful solution to denuclearization on the peninsula. So we are continuing with the military dimension to support primarily Secretary Tillerson's economic and diplomatic pressure campaign, but also making it clear that there are military options available to the President if the economic and diplomatic pressure campaign fails. We think that's important that North Korea understand that. We also think it's important that China understand that. And I personally went to China in the middle of August during the recess to deliver that message to Chinese senior leadership.
When you look at North Korea, and there's significant speculation about Kim Jong-un's motives, but do you think it's about just survival of the regime, or do you think he is also looking to take over South Korea as well?
Senator, I look back at our experience with North Korea, and I realize that Kim Jong-un has only been there for a short period of the history. Since 1953, we have effectively deterred North Korea from attacking attacking into South Korea. My assessment, based on the intelligence I've read, is that Kim Jong-un's development of nuclear capability and his development of missile technology is primarily associated with regime survival. That's not to say that they don't pose a threat to South Korea and to others in the region, but my judgment is that that is what has driven his path of development over the past 18 months.
Switching over a little bit to Syria, you've had significant success in Iraq, moving ISIS out. There's ongoing battles in the Raqqa area. 6 months from now, where do you hope to be?
6 months from now, Senator, I guess from experience, always cautious about laying out timelines, and so I won't for the campaign. But I do believe that we will have completed operations more properly. Our partners will have completed operations in Raqqa, and we'll be well on our way to going after the external operations capability and immediate capability of ISIS that remains in the middle Euphrates River Valley. And we'll also be supporting our Iraqi security forces partners on the east side of the border to better secure the border between Iraq and Syria. So I think we'll have continued to degrade Most importantly, their external operations capability, the ability they have to plan and conduct external operations, I think will have undermined the credibility of the narrative. They will increasingly not be able to say that there's a physical caliphate in existence. I think that'll have an impact on the recruiting. We've already seen the numbers drop, the numbers of individuals who are inspired to join the ISIS movement. So I think we'll continue to see reduction in territory, reduction in freedom of movement, reduced resources, and less credibility in the narrative. Those are the 4 areas where I think we'll continue to see progress.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Ask what your take is on the vote in Kurdistan.
Chairman, in the wake of that vote, my primary concern now is making sure that the vote doesn't disrupt the cooperation that we have seen between the Peshmerga and Iraqi security forces. The real challenge in the campaign right now is that operations in the north, the reason why we were successful in Mosul, the reason we're successful in the north is because of the cooperation between the Peshmerga and Iraqi security forces. If you look at the next area that the Iraqis are focused on in the Hawija area, which is southwest of Kirkuk, it's going to require cooperation between the Kurds and Iraqi security forces. So I'm concerned that the referendum will disrupt that cooperation, but my focus from a military perspective will be to try to mitigate the effects, and I know that's what Secretary Mattis and General Votel are also trying to do, is mitigate the effects.
And President Erdogan has made some pretty aggressive statements.
President Erdogan has made some very aggressive statements, and so have the Iranians, Chairman.
Senator Cotton.
General, welcome back. Congratulations on your renomination, and thank you for your many decades of service. In your written testimony, you stay on page 10 that Iran has not changed its malign activities since the JCPOA went into effect. Have they increased the pace or scope of their malign activities?
Senator, I think you could argue that they have, certainly in Syria. I think it's been relatively constant in Yemen with regard to their support for the Houthis. Clearly, their support for Lebanese Hezbollah has been at a high level for some period of time. So in those 3 areas, I would say that Syria is the one place where it's probably increased. And you could argue over the last few months whether or not it's related to JCPOA or not, that Iranian activity inside of Iraq has certainly increased as they look to the end game in Iraq.
Thank you. Without going into the content of rules of engagement, which are obviously classified, have our rules of engagement changed in the last 8 months since President Trump took office in the Persian Gulf as it relates to Iranian harassment using small craft or drones or aircraft?
Our rules of engagement have not changed, Senator. What we have done in the wake of a number of incidents is we've gone back at every level from the 5th Fleet to the United States Central Command and made it very clear what our forces were capable of doing were they to be threatened. And so I'm confident that it's in application of rules of engagement, if our forces are threatened, they are both postured and capable of effectively responding.
Thank you. On page 29 and 30 of your written testimony, you restate your support for our nuclear triad, as well as modernizing the National Airborne Operations Command Center. Strangely to me, the Air Force has just announced that the next version of Air Force One will not have in-flight refueling capability. What do you make of that?
Senator, I think that was a decision that was not made by the Air Force, but made by the White House, and I think it had to do with fiscal constraints on the program. That will certainly be a limiting factor, and we'll have to plan accordingly.
I think we might need to revisit that decision here on Capitol Hill. I want to turn to the Open Skies Treaty. Not many Americans know about that, but it allows the United States and Russia and many other countries, but primarily those 2 countries, to fly aircraft over each other's territory and to take lots of pictures. Russia has been violating that treaty, as Secretary Mattis testified earlier this year. I assume that you agree with his testimony from earlier this year.
I do, Senator, and we as a nation declared them in violation back in June.
And there's a Wall Street Journal article today saying that in Vienna today, we will take steps to curb their flights in response to their actions by limiting our flights over Kaliningrad, their enclave in Europe, at which they held most of Europe at risk, their limitations in Abkhazia and South Ossetia and Chechnya, and also their altitude floor over Moscow. Are those steps that we're about to take?
Those are all part of an overall effort. Senator, let me probably just make sure that we make it clear. We believe that on balance it would be best if the treaty continued to be in place. But we don't believe the treaty should be in place if the Russians aren't compliant. And so there is a decidedly aggressive diplomatic effort right now to bring the Russians back into compliance, which we think would be the best outcome.
Do you expect some of these reported steps, for instance, restricting flights over Alaska and Hawaii, will bring Russia back into compliance?
Senator, I don't know, but this is the best plan we have right now to bring them in compliance before we may consider other alternatives.
Given the size and capabilities of our satellite constellation versus Russia's, is it fair to say that Russia gets more benefit from these flights than does the United States?
I believe that argument's been made, and it's compelling to me.
I want to turn to missile defense in North Korea. We focus a lot on systems like Aegis Ashore and THAAD, or West Coast interceptors. What's the prospects currently for a boost phase intercept, specifically from unmanned aerial vehicles, either with hit-to-kill interceptors or with directed energy?
Senator, there's been a lot of work done on boost phase. As you know from asking the question, we don't have that capability right now. I would offer to you a classified briefing at a time of your convenience to walk you through where we think we may be right now, but we do not have that capability today.
I think we have that scheduled for later today. Be a hell of a thing if we could put a UAV up over the North Korean peninsula and shoot down any missile as it was taking off. I'd suggest that we need to look as aggressively as we can at that. Finally, General, the deaths of the sailors in the Western Pacific has commanded a lot of attention, rightfully so. You had, I believe, 15 Marines that were badly wounded a couple weeks ago out on the West Coast, though, in a fire involving an amphibious assault vehicle. How are those Marines doing today?
Senator, I don't know how each one of them individually is doing, but we've been getting routine reports about their progress, and they are making progress. So some of them, some significant injuries.
I know that the Marine Corps is conducting a review of the matter and will have a report. What's the likelihood that the impact of the many years of sequestration budget cuts could have played a role in either the level of training or operations and maintenance for that vehicle in this incident?
Senator, I can't talk to that specific incident, but I am confident that a combination of fiscal challenges and high operational tempo have created conditions that actually have led to some of these incidents. Of that, I'm confident.
Thank you, General.
Senator Rono.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. General Dunford, welcome back. And it was a pleasure to meet with you not too long ago. And with the natural disasters that have been occurring, I also want to take this opportunity to thank the many members of our armed forces, including the active National Guard and Reserve personnel who were very instrumental in helping to save lives and transporting supplies during the recent natural disasters. General Dunford, in your 2015 confirmation hearing to serve as chairman, you stated that Russia presented the greatest threat to our national security, and you included their nuclear capability, ability to interfere with our sovereignty of our allies, and you said their behavior was nothing short of alarming. And of course, we can now add involvement in our elections to the list. You then rank-ordered China, North Korea, and ISIL as 2 to 4 on your list of threats to national security. In the intervening time, we have North Korea. So my question, as we sit here today, would you change your threat assessment order? Is North Korea still 3rd on your list?
Senator, the one thing I've said to my staff is that we don't actually have the luxury of identifying a single threat today, unfortunately, nor necessary to look at it in a linear fashion. So what I would say is that in terms of a sense of urgency today, North Korea certainly poses the greatest threat today. In terms of overall military capability, I believe Russia poses the greatest threat because of the nuclear, cyber, electronic warfare, and the activity that we've seen from the Crimea to the Ukraine. If I look out to 2025, and I look at the demographics and the economic situation, I think China probably poses the greatest threat to our nation by about 2025, and that's consistent with much of our analysis. So that's in other words, I can't look at it just in terms of overall capability, but I've got to factor in time and conditions, and when I do that, I look at all 3 of those threats in that way.
I would agree with you in terms of your assessment, and particularly with regard to North Korea being an immediate threat. I'm always asked, of course, Hawaii being in the middle of the Pacific, we feel quite vulnerable. So it is on the forefront of certainly of my minds of constituents, and particularly, of course, not just Hawaii, but Guam and Alaska. And I understand that the results of the ballistic missile defense review are expected later this year. Is that correct?
Senator, they are, but we didn't wait for the review to request increased ballistic missile defense capability. We've done that in the last couple of weeks, and also noted that in the NDAA, the committee also addressed that.
Well, I know that a large new radar system is being planned for Hawaii, and I just had a meeting with Admiral Harris, and this will take a few years, and he indicated that it would be good to move up the radar for Hawaii a year or two, and I'd really like to put that in to your way of thinking so that we can get on with that radar system. I certainly want to ensure that Hawaii, Alaska, and the rest of the United States are protected. Do you, as we sit here today, are we adequately protected? Alaska, Hawaii, rest of the United States?
Senator, we are adequately protected against the current threat. And I think one of the issues that we all ought to appreciate is that as the capacity of the threat increases, that is the size, not just the lethality, not just the fact that North Korea can reach us, but the numbers of missiles that they may possess that can reach us. And what we need to be concerned about is ensuring that our ballistic missile defense capability keeps pace with that threat.
I think it's very important to have that ongoing assessment, and in particular, if we project maybe 3 years down the road, as far as North Korea's capabilities, I believe that there is an assessment occurring as to whether or not Hawaii needs a system in place besides the radar. So. That is my understanding.
Absolutely, Senator, and we are constantly assessing, and again, as recently as the last several weeks where we made some recommendations based on that assessment, our ability to protect all Americans, Guam, Hawaii, continental United States, Alaska.
I know you were asked about the JCPOA, and you state that briefings you have received indicate that Iran is adhering to its obligations under the JCPOA. My question is, as long as Iran is in compliance, is it in America's national security interest to maintain the JCPOA?
Senator, the intel community assessment is, in fact, that they are in compliance right now, and therefore I think we should focus on addressing the other challenges, the missile threat they pose, the maritime threat they pose, the support of proxies, terrorists, and the cyber threat they pose.
Yes, and those were not areas that were covered under the JCPOA.
They were not, Senator.
Yes. So is it your intent to advise the President to recertify Iran's compliance ahead of the October 15th deadline?
Senator, mindful of the Chairman's opening comments, what I would ask is if I could provide the advice that I'm providing to the President now prior to his decision to be in private, certainly share that, but not to do that publicly until after the President has made a decision.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Rounds.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. General, first of all, thank you for your service to our country. General, the Budget Control Act is a symptom of a much larger problem Congress has been avoiding for far too long, a looming national security issue that I hope you could comment on. The Congressional Budget Office reports that by 2025, mandatory spending will be 51% higher than it is today, and interest we pay on the national debt will nearly double as a percentage of GDP. CBO projects that the impact on discretionary spending will result in about a 13% reduction to defense spending as a percentage of GDP. My question is, as the future years defense program begins to overlap the mid-2020s, has the Department of Defense started to look at how this fiscal picture might change what we can afford and where we invest? And has the potential fiscal future been accounted for in any of our future operating concepts or global power projection strategies?
Senator, our planning to date, first and foremost, has highlighted the fact that our capabilities are going to require somewhere between 3% and 7%. And we can debate that, and I'm perfectly willing to come over here with the analytic foundation for my assessment that between 3% and 7%, and that's dependent on how much risk you want to assume as you build a force, but between 3% and 7% is going to be required for us to build the capabilities we need. Where did we come up with that percentage? We looked at the capabilities of Russia and China today. We looked at the trajectory that they are on for capability development. We looked at where we are today and what investments we need to have to maintain a competitive advantage over those peer competitors. We use them as a benchmark, if you will, in the mid-2020s. What I would say, I suppose, in response to your question is that we will have to fundamentally reorder the strategy if we are unable to build the capabilities and capacities to deal with those peer competitors. Right now, what we have done is we've taken the national security strategy. We've taken initial guidance from Secretary Mattis. He'll come out later with a defense strategy after the first of the year. And we've looked at the military capabilities and capacities necessary to support those strategies. There will be a fundamental disconnect if we don't move on a path that I've just described.
And yet at the same time, as Senator Hirono has just asked, the concern right now with regard to the topic of the day, which is North Korea, and the threats that they may pose and the additional responsibilities imposed upon our military to respond to this particular country's current activities and the threats that they suggest with regard to, the use of ICBMs against any part of our country or our allies. And so in this particular case, as you've indicated, you believe, or at least you think that right now we have the capabilities. But does that include the ability right now to protect Hawaii against an ICBM attack by North Korea? And was that planned in? And what happens when that occurs? Do we do that, and do we place our resources on that? And does that change the overall planning for the next 7 to 10 years?
Sure, Senator, based on the current capacity of the North Koreans, the current threat, so both the type of the threat and the amount of missiles that they possess, we can protect Hawaii today against an ICBM. We can protect the continental United States against an ICBM.
But it seems as though the American public simply assumed that that is just automatic, and then we've got the resources to not only respond to that and to still be able to build for the future threats, or at least to maintain our ability to defend against those future threats from our other peer competitors. And I guess that's my point is when we look at all of the different threats that are out there, the assumption that we simply have the resources right now and that we're not just keeping pace, but we are improving, is that a fair assumption on the part of the American public?
Senator, there's a few things that I wouldn't assume in the future were we not to make investments. I wouldn't assume access to space and all that means for our economy and for our military capability. I wouldn't assume our ability to protect our networks, both for commercial activity and military activity. I wouldn't assume our ability to deal with the growing electronic warfare threat of our adversaries, and I wouldn't assume the capability to deal with the growing ballistic missile and cruise missile threat of our adversaries unless we maintain pace with capability development. Those would be bad assumptions.
And that requires more than what we would otherwise find under the 2011 Budget Control Act.
There's no question. In fact, just to maybe put it in perspective, Senator, the bipartisan NDAA that you just passed is $89 billion more than what the BCA level would be, and probably some number less than what some members of the committee thought it ought to be.
Thank you, General. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Kaine.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. General, welcome and congratulations on the renomination, and you have done a superb job, and my vote is going to be that you continue to do a superb job. Thank you for the service. You have testified often to us about the readiness challenges, and we had a pretty sobering hearing last week digging into the potential sources of these Navy collisions and readiness issues, and the extent of training is something that was on the table. We've had a recent report from the GAO about increased operations and extended maintenance challenges have posed real problems on the Navy side. I was with the commander of the Langley Air Force Base this weekend, and he described to me reduction in training hours as being a real challenge. So everything you have testified to us about diminished readiness resulting from the budget sequester is coming true. It wasn't Chicken Little saying the sky is falling. What we've heard from military leaders since the sequester went into effect and the budget caps in March of 2013, we're seeing it. And I just think that it puts an additional burden on our shoulders to try to deal with it. I want to ask you about something that I'm really worried about now, which is the humanitarian crisis in Puerto Rico. So often when there's a humanitarian crisis anywhere in the world, a tsunami in Southeast Asia, an Ebola crisis in Africa, the U.S. military is there, a projection of America's humanitarian spirit. And I'm just stunned at this humanitarian challenge in Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico, American citizens with an amazing track record of serving in the military over generations, centuries really. Could you talk a little bit about current DOD operations to try to prevent this humanitarian crisis from really spiraling downward in a way that would be devastating to these American citizens?
Senator, thank you. In fact, one of the last things I did this morning before coming over here was go through the Northern Command update. We get those every few hours, and so I had the most recent update as of about 8:30 before I came over here to the Hill. For us, it's both professional and personal. These are Americans that need support. I've got people who have their families in Puerto Rico on my staff. One of the heads of my personal security detail until last night hadn't heard from his family yet. So this is something that's been on our minds and our thoughts and prayers with the people in Puerto Rico. The key thing that I think we are delivering right now, one of the challenges, Senator, in getting aid has been the ports and airfields weren't accessible. And so step one is we're doing all we can do right now to increase the throughput of humanitarian supplies. That's something the U.S. military can uniquely provide. We also are providing some generators and so forth for power. We don't expect them to have power for some time, so that's something that is important that we can provide.
And this impacts hospitals. And
that's right.
Long-term
so we have
care
generators and so
facilities
forth
that cannot afford to be without continuous power.
Absolutely, Senator, and that's why power generation and generators are one of the key areas we're focused on right now. Fresh water and food, clearly right away, and then medical capabilities. So those are the key areas that Northern Command under General Robinson's leadership are focused on right now. There's literally hourly meetings between FEMA and the government officials in Puerto Rico to make sure that we are doing all we can. The guidance from Secretary Mattis has been clear. What they need, they get. Just make it happen. And so what we're doing right now is just making sure that every place that we can uniquely contribute to the disaster in Puerto Rico, we're poised to do that. And we're anticipating what they might need next week, even if they haven't thought about it yet.
And just for purposes of committee members and the public, I think I know the answer to this, but I'm not sure I do. How was the response to Puerto Rico sort of organized? The DOD has a piece of it, but you are not necessarily the lead.
Right.
Is that sort of organized through DHS and FEMA, and then, with the DOD taking on an assigned role? Is that sort of how it's being led?
That's exactly right, Senator. This is any place in the United States, and so we are in support of FEMA, and General Robinson is a supporting agency to FEMA. And so we're doing all of the support for Puerto Rico is being coordinated, as you suggest, through Department of Homeland Security and FEMA specifically. And but again, we're doing two things. We're responding to the immediate requests, but then we have a little experience in these kind of operations. And so I know what General Robinson and her team are doing also is offering things that maybe people haven't asked for today, and also looking around the corner to see what they might need next week.
Very, very important for us to be on this because the scale of it is just devastating, and I appreciate your testimony. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Senator Ernst.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, General Dunford, Ellen, to you both and your family. Thank you so much for your support of our men and women in uniform. I know it's a joint effort, so thank you very much. We do agree, General, that properly resourcing a joint force really is a collaborative effort between Congress and our military and those military leaders. That is why many on this committee have pushed to repeal BCA. Senator Rounds brought up the financial implications moving forward and what sequestration might do in regards to many other issues that we're facing with our mandatory spending. But looking at that, we also need to use what we have efficiently and effectively. I'm pushing for an audit within the DOD. I think many of us support that. We need to know that our taxpayer dollars are being spent well. For your part, can you describe the steps that you have taken during your tenure as the chairman to work with that joint force and make it more efficient? Are there specific examples you can give the committee today?
There are, Senator. The first one is that we're implementing the direction that we have from the Congress to reduce our overall headquarters by 30%. That in itself is not an insignificant step that we have taken. Also, with regard, we alluded to it with global force management. What we have done is done a number of things to integrate at the strategic level the prioritization and the allocation of resources to ensure that we are deploying them most effectively and in the context of our strategic objectives. And then there's a number of things that, of course, wouldn't be something that I would do in a joint force, but certainly am familiar with in dealing with the chiefs. Business practices across the department are also an area where efficiencies are sought. The leader for that is the Deputy Secretary of Defense, and on the Joint Staff, the Vice Chairman sits with him on what's called the Defense Management Advisory Group, and that involves all of the Vice Chiefs. And there's a wide range of business practices that we're looking to be more efficient. Fortunately, we do have some expertise now from outside the department that has come in and looked at us through a different lens, and so those are areas where I think there were most promise. But the other thing I'd say, Senator, is that since 2010, we have gone through a litany of efficiency drills. And while we have gained some efficiencies, they never quite realize the savings that you expect them to, so you got to stay after it. But this isn't something that we started just in the past year. We really have, I think, in a concerted way, been after it since 2010.
Very good, General, and I am certain that you will continue that push going on as we hope to see you continuing in this position. So I thank you for that. And then in your answers to advanced policy questions, you also stressed your concern regarding our near-peer overmatch, and I share that concern as well. Unfortunately, the department will send mixed messages to Congress. On one hand, our services ask for rapid acquisition of commercial off-the-shelf systems as a solution, and on the other, then they prefer appropriating dollars forward for the next best and greatest thing. But unfortunately, a lot of times the next best, greatest thing never really materializes. So how are we going to prioritize acquisitions moving in the future?
Senator, that, as you know, is a complicated issue, and I think getting the balance right between moving out right now and buying what's available and then looking long-term for the most effective capability has been something we struggle with. On the one hand, you might quickly say, hey, we ought to just be able to go out and buy what's available and field it. Well, I can remember some years ago when we ended up with 16 links that could communicate from air to ground, and but they couldn't necessarily communicate with each other. I can also remember when we all went out and bought our own software, only to find out that we couldn't effectively communicate with each other. So there is a balance in all of this, and I think the key thing is in the committee inserted some of the language in the NDAA, and that is to make sure that the Joint Requirements Oversight Council, which is led by the Vice Chairman and reports to me and the chiefs, is effectively, one, overseeing the requirements that are existing for capabilities, and also then the process for making sure that we meet those requirements in a timely manner and that those requirements are actually validated. And I think that's probably a key piece of it too, is the requirements. I think if you get the requirements right and senior leadership is engaged in the requirements, and I say this both from the perspective of my current job as well as a former service chief, service leader engagement with the requirements, validating those requirements before we look at material and non-material solutions to those requirements, in my judgment, is the key to success. And that is something that I think has happened to a greater degree over the last couple of years with the pressure in part that has been put on by this committee.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, General. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Senator King.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Beginning with, I know, General Dunford, you're a reader, and going back to the chairman's statements at the beginning of this hearing about the relationship between the military and civilian officials, I commend to you, although I suspect you have already read a dereliction of duty by your colleague, General McMaster, a stunning analysis of what not to do in terms of the relationship between civilian and military officials. You nodded. I assume that means you know the book.
Senator, I have read it.
And I think an additional one I would add to your list, it's a little bit longer, Barbara Tuchman's March of Folly, which takes us from Troy to Vietnam, again, talking about relationships and how these mistakes are made. Which brings me to Korea. I have a queasy feeling that we're in 1914 stumbling towards Sarajevo. And what worries me is not an instantaneous nuclear confrontation, but an accidental escalation. Based upon the rhetoric that's going back and forth. The foreign minister of North Korea yesterday characterized our president's comments as a declaration of war. And he said, therefore, since the United States has declared war on our country, we will have every right to make countermeasures, including the right to shoot down United States strategic bombers, even when they are not in the airspace border of our country. That's what worries me, is a misinterpretation, misunderstanding, and an event, a shooting down of a bomber, a strike on a ship that leads to a countermeasure, and the end result is if Kim Jong-un feels his regime is under attack, then the unthinkable happens. Make me either feel better or worse about where we are.
Senator, I will make you feel better. I can tell you that I personally, the Secretary of Defense and Admiral Harris, are looking at all of our posture in managing risk on a day-to-day basis, informed by the need to avoid the risk of miscalculation. The recent operations that we conducted, I can assure you that even I was on the road. We probably, Secretary Mattis and I probably personally invested several hours each in reviewing those, to manage those, and without going into classified information here, to look at all of our capabilities, look at all their capabilities, look at timing, look at the probabilities.
What worries me about is misunderstanding and misinterpretation. What we view as an exercise, they may view as an imminent threat.
Senator, I guess what I'm suggesting to you is that where we conduct these exercises, we're informed by the North Korean posture at a given point in time. We're informed by the need to avoid miscalculation in an inadvertent engagement.
Do we have communication with North Korea with regard to these kinds of situations? This is just an exercise, for example.
We do not have military-to-military communications with North Korea right now.
Turning the North Korea question slightly, you testified earlier, and all the intelligence community agrees, that Kim Jong-un's primary motivation is regime survival. Therefore, it seems to me that statements that suggest regime change or regime destruction only solidify his determination to develop and maintain nuclear weapons. Would you agree?
Senator, I have been very careful at the military level to make no statements that would exacerbate the current crisis, and I certainly won't comment on things that our senior political leadership have said, but I certainly can tell you inside the military, we've made no statements, and we've had a conscious decision not to make any such statements to ensure that the lead right now is Secretary Tillerson, and the message that being delivered is primarily being delivered by the State Department.
But you do agree that the primary motivation for the development of the nuclear weapons is a kind of insurance policy for regime survival. Is that not the case?
That'd be my assessment, Senator.
Fine, thank you. What would be the practicality of a preemptive nuclear strike or a preemptive military strike on North Korea in terms of the military effect? Would it? There's some feeling, I hear somebody talked about a preemptive strike the other day, not in the administration, but on this in this body. That would not be a short, easy action, would it not?
Senator, you bring up a good point, and part of the advice that I've provided to date is when we do something, we shouldn't assume at that point that we can control escalation. So we need to think about this in terms of what might happen as well as what we would want to happen.
And part of the problem is those artillery that are ranged across the North Korean border within Seoul, which is about as far as from here to Fairfax County.
That's right. The greater Seoul area, which has 25 million people, 250,000 Americans on any given day, it would be in Seoul, would certainly be threatened by the rockets and the missiles along the border.
So a military, the idea of a so-called surgical strike, to bring back a term from 40 years ago, is really not valid in this situation. It would not be, this is not something that would be easy to take out, for example, the nuclear capability of the North Koreans.
No, that's right, Senator. I mean, while we could do things that, from our perspective, it could be less than a full execution of an operations plan, we need to be informed by the potential risk to the Greater Seoul area, no matter what we do on the peninsula. I think that's fair.
Thank you, General. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Colonel Wicker.
Chairman Dunford, do you support providing lethal defensive aid to Ukraine?
I do, Senator, and have made that recommendation.
As I understand it, DOD has officially made an affirmative recommendation, and State Department also. So where is that decision, and can you enlighten the committee?
Senator, my understanding is that decision is at the White House.
And do you have any idea when we might be able to get an answer on that?
I don't, Senator. I will ask when we get back today. We've been asking for the last couple of weeks, but I'm not sure.
Well, I think it's very important that the Ukrainian government succeed in resisting further Russian expansion. Why did you recommend yes on providing lethal aid?
In my judgment, from a military perspective, the Ukraine needed additional capabilities to protect their sovereignty. As you probably know, Senator, in 2016, we trained a number of their battalions. 2017, trained additional battalions. We provided medical supplies, night vision goggles, counter-mortar radars, and other things. But we felt like their ability to stop armored vehicles and so forth would be essential to them to protect themselves. And so we just looked at it as a military gap that existed, that if that gap was filled, it would increase the probability the Ukrainians could defend themselves.
And I agree. I would just encourage members of the administration to move forward on that. With regard to Russia's asymmetric threats, such as information operations, cyber attacks, and jamming, I want to ask you specifically about the 173rd Airborne Brigade, which is said in a report to be under-equipped, undermanned, and inadequately organized. According to an Army review, 3 years after Crimea, why is this the case? Is it the case, and what can we do about it?
Senator, I read the media article and asked a couple of questions after I saw it. And I think what the leader was doing was describing, the current character of war and indicating that he believed that we ought to make some organizational changes and some equipment changes to make the 173rd base in Vicenza, Italy, more competitive. I think you could make that statement more broadly. So this was a leader looking at his particular unit. I think you can look at that statement more broadly and say that we need to adapt the U.S. military, really the entire U.S. government, to be able to compete at that level below war, where the Russians have so successfully integrated information operations, cyber, political influence, economic coercion, and information operations. So really, I think what the 173rd was describing is a force that is designed for conventional war, and in needing to make some organizational changes and add different capabilities to be competitive in the space that we're describing now.
So, writ large, actually, this fairly accurate statement about the 173rd actually could be said about the entire Department of Defense. Is that what you're telling this committee?
Well, Senator, I think I would broaden it. What I would say is today, Russians, Chinese, and others are on a day-to-day basis doing what I describe as they are conducting adversarial competition at a level that falls below conflict. And they have integrated the entire government to be able to do that. And in my judgment, we need to improve our ability to compete in that space. And in the areas specifically I would mention from military capability would be our electronic warfare capability, our cyber capabilities, and our information operations capability. But those all have to be integrated with those things that we don't have inside the Department of Defense, of course, the economic and political tools. But in my judgment, bringing all those together on a day-to-day basis more effectively is something that we do need to do.
And finally, General, with regard to the 355 ship requirement, this is a requirement that's been developed by the generals and admirals in consultation with our leadership around the world. This committee, in the form of the NDAA, has put the SHIPS Act in the Senate-passed version. It makes the 355 ship requirement the policy of the United States Congress. The House of Representatives has also done that, and I expect this will be coming out of conference very soon. This requirement is, in fact, a serious requirement, is it not? And can you assure us that from the level of the administration, we're serious about getting to that number and getting and fulfilling that requirement rather than the 276 ships we have, and doing it as quick as practicable?
Senator, I don't think there's any question that all of us know that the Navy is smaller right now than it needs to be to meet all of those requirements, and that requirement that you've identified is one that's based on analytic rigor, and it should be a target that we shoot for. It'd be good to get there as soon as we can, and of course, many of the conversations we're having about the budget will inform our ability to do that, but we certainly appreciate your leadership in that regard.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Heinrich.
Thank you, Chairman McCain. Welcome, General Dunford. I want to follow up on Senator King's line of questioning with regard to North Korea. As you're aware, all 6 of North Korea's previous nuclear tests have occurred underground. That obviously contains the radioactive fallout. But Kim Jong-un has since threatened to conduct a test in the Earth's atmosphere. Can you talk a little bit about what the global risks and implications of a nuclear weapon detonated in the atmosphere would be, as Kim Jong-un is reportedly considering? And if you were speaking to the North Korean people right now, what would you say to them regarding the risks of detonating a nuclear weapon in the Earth's atmosphere?
No, Senator, I think the best experience we have recently, of course, would be the nuclear reactor in Russia some years ago and the incident that took place in Japan. And even with something that isn't anywhere near what the North Koreans are suggesting, we had significant health challenges for many, many years, and obviously the loss of life. It'd be an incredibly provocative thing for them to conduct a nuclear test in the Pacific as they have suggested. And you know, I think the North Korean people would have to realize how serious that would be, not only for the United States, but for the international community.
I want to just take a quick moment to thank both you and Secretary Mattis for the sober and serious manner that you're approaching North Korea. I think that is the sort of temperament we need now more than ever. I want to shift gears real quickly. Our Commander of Special Operations, General Thomas, has said that the use of weaponized commercially available drones by our adversaries was SOCOM's, quote, most daunting problem, end quote, in 2016. How serious is the threat, and can you explain why it's so difficult to deal with this threat with conventional weapons and kinetic means?
First, Senator, I agree with General Thomas's assessment, and that's the consistent feedback we have from our operational commanders. And in fact, about 4 months ago, we sent a team over, led by my J-8, Lieutenant General Tony Iriarty, to sit down with the commanders to make sure we had a full appreciation of what they were dealing with, so we can come back here and immediately send to them every single capability we possibly could. And we've made some progress in that regard in their ability to deal with this particular threat. But it's also going to require continued experimentation and adaptation to make sure that we stay out in front of the technology that the enemy has delivered. So this, we have seen them deliver chemical weapons. We've seen them deliver bombs. We've seen them be able to provide increased intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance against our partners on the ground largely. And so it does create a significant challenge, and we have done all we can do today to deal with that challenge, as well as develop the capabilities we'll need tomorrow. But I can assure you personally that has been exactly where General Thomas has suggested it should be, at the top of our list for current emerging threats in the current fight.
Well, I have to say I've been pleased to see the Pentagon respond so quickly with investments in laser technologies and other systems to address urgent needs like this one. Will you continue to support the Pentagon's use of rapid acquisition authorities provided by this committee to field new technologies like laser and high-power microwaves to help counter those drones and swarms?
I will, Senator. I think that having that capability has been one of the bright spots in what has been a largely criticized acquisition process.
Yeah, I would agree, and I think that directed energy on both of those fronts is a potential game changer for what's a a rapidly developing situation with drones in particular. I want to return real quickly to an issue that Senator Kaine brought up earlier with regard to Puerto Rico. And you mentioned throughput, and one of the things that I understand is a bottleneck with throughput right now in that emergency response is the number of radars that are down and the fact that planes are landing, C-130s, et cetera, on VFR if there's not radar at various airfields. Does DOD have a role in restoring the radar at those airfields? Is that DHS? And what can you tell us about hopefully the easing of that bottleneck, which really limits how much we can get in there on a reasonable time period?
Senator, we do have the capability, and are right now, again, that's our priority, is focused on making sure the airfields can operate. A piece of their ability to operate will be those expeditionary radars that we have, and we could provide as required on a short-term basis. The responsibility is primarily DHS, but at this point, we're not trapped in bureaucratic niceties. What we're trying to do is make sure that we get the people of Puerto Rico the support they need when they need it. And the key thing that needs to be done right now, as you're suggesting, is all of the other support they need can't come in until we get the ports and airfields open. Exactly, and so right. That's why Northern Command has placed that at the top of the list of support we're providing.
Thanks. Thank you very much, General Dunford.
On behalf of the Chairman McCain, Senator Perdue, please.
General Dunford, thank you for being here today. Thank you for you and your family for your service. I want to remind the committee that the first ship was, I believe, the USS Mercy in Port-au-Prince after the earthquake. And I want to thank the military on record here for always being the first in crisis like this in Puerto Rico. I want to highlight again a quote that was already referred to by the chairman this morning, because I think in February you called out this crisis. We have a global security crisis, but we have a debt crisis. And the two right now are, and you're the first one, I believe, to call this out. Your quote was, "Without sustained, sufficient, and predictable funding, I assess that within 5 years, we will lose our ability to project power, the basis of how we defend the homeland, advance U.S. interest, and meet our alliance commitments." Wow. Sir, that's a few months forward. Do you still stand by that assessment?
Senator, I do. And if I could just make a quick comment. I know many times the perception is that military leaders will never be satisfied with good enough and they'll always want more. And so somehow maybe people aren't looking at those comments with the seriousness that I intended them to be. I would not have made those comments without having gone on a long journey of analytic rigor to really, truly be able to quantify exactly what I'm talking about. I think we've shared with you, Senator, because of your interest, we've shared with you some of the results of our work. But those words are backed by a fairly exhaustive analytic effort that shows specific capability areas where we are in the process of losing our competitive advantage. And in the aggregate, when you go out 4 or 5 years, the loss of our competitive advantage in those specific areas means we will not be able to project power when and where necessary to advance our interests. That does two things. It not only affects our response to crisis, but it increases the probability there will be a crisis because it will have an adverse effect on a deterrent capability of the U.S. military. I believe that one of the things that deters others today from a conventional conflict is their knowledge that we do have a competitive conventional advantage over any adversary today, and we can project power when and where necessary to advance our interests. Were we to lose that, I believe that there would be an increased possibility of conflict, particularly against our peer competitors.
Well, that's the question I have today for you, sir, is, if you look at the latest estimate, back in 2011, then Chairman Gates, Secretary of Defense then, made the estimate based on a bottoms-up estimate from the military on needs, and that estimate was, in today's dollars, for 2016, about $753 billion. Last year, we actually appropriated $623 all, and that's all of category 050, I believe. This year, it's going to be a little bit greater than that, 677 or thereabouts, but we're still significantly less than just what Secretary Gates wanted back then for 2016. That was before ISIS, Crimea, Ukraine, Syria, Iran, North Korea, and on and on and on, with Russia and China's growing capabilities. Sir, my question, and oh, by the way, you mentioned 3 to 7%. I don't disagree with that. I don't know what the need is, but I know that we are at a low point right now historically. I can look at the history. We've averaged over the last 30 years after Vietnam 4%. We're now at 3%. That 100 basis points is $200 billion. So any way you look at it today, my estimate is somewhere between 150 and 200 that we're short today, even with being $89 billion above the BCA. Sir, my question is, how do you determine the priorities going forward with that kind of shortfall? Because every dime that we're spending on the military today and on our veterans and on all domestic discretionary spending, let me say this again, every dime that we spend on our military and our veterans today, by definition, is borrowed money. In the last 8 years, and it's projected the next 10 years will be similar, we borrowed 35% of what we spent as a federal government. 25% of that spending is discretionary, and military is part of that. Sir, given all of that, you and Secretary Mattis have talked about the first step in the strategy is filling the hole. Are we on board doing that now with the appropriation this year? And what does the next 2 or 3 years look like in terms of trying to catch up with a number of years, not just the last 6 or 8, a number of years, 20 years even, of disinvesting in the military?
No, thanks, Senator. The way that we have characterized in our recommendations is that we have readiness challenges. That's been described as the filling the holes. We have lethality challenges, and by that we mean areas like electronic warfare, cyber capability, our strike capability that needs to be improved. And then there's a capacity issue. And ideally, we'd be addressing all of those. We'd be addressing the current readiness of the force that we have. We'd be improving the capabilities we need for tomorrow, and we'd be increasing the capacity of the force to meet the overall requirements that we have. So the way we've chosen to prioritize it is to make sure that we, number one, make sure that the men and women today in those units that we're deploying have the wherewithal to accomplish the mission with minimal loss of life or equipment. That's job one. The second thing we're doing, and you saw this in the last 2 years, is starting to make increased investments, number one, in our nuclear enterprise, because deterring nuclear war is job one for the department, and then addressing some of these deficiencies in cyber capabilities, electronic warfare, ballistic missile defense, which we've spoken about. What we have not done is come in with a recommendation to increase the size or the capacity of the force, because in my judgment, we should not do that unless we can do it in a balanced way. And there's no way with the current level of resourcing we have and the projected level of resourcing that we can grow the force in a balanced way. So I think we're forced to fill the holes, address the readiness, and then do what we can to invest in the capabilities that we need to maintain competitiveness today and tomorrow. But I don't see in the near term our ability to really grow the force to get after the dynamic that has been discussed a bit this morning, where we have fewer ships than are necessary even to do ballistic missile defense on a day-to-day basis in the Pacific. And that's the challenge that we have, and that's kind of the 3 ways we think about it.
Yes, sir. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
On behalf of Chairman McCain, Senator Warren, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. General Dunford, good to see you here. So I want to ask you about the nuclear deal between the United States, the 5 partner nations, and Iran that has placed Iran's nuclear program under verifiable limits and unprecedented inspections so that it cannot develop a nuclear weapon. The Trump administration has already certified twice to Congress that Iran is complying with this agreement. If President Trump does not certify again by October 15th, he risks blowing up this agreement, and Iran may restart again building a nuclear weapon. Now, when asked about the Iran nuclear deal in January, Secretary Mattis told this committee that it is, quote, an imperfect arms control agreement. But he also said, quote, when America gives her word, we have to live up to it and work with our allies. General, do you agree with that?
Senator, I do, and my recommendation the previous 2 times was informed by that and the fact that the intelligence community had determined that there was not a material breach to the JCPOA. And so what I recommended is that we focus leveraging our partners that were part of that agreement to deal with those other challenges that we know Iran poses, whether it's the terrorist threat, the maritime threat, and so forth.
Well, you know, this is always the issues. Iran supports terrorism, engages in human rights abuses, works to develop ballistic missiles. But I think it's easier to counter Iran's destabilizing behavior if it has no nuclear weapon than it would be to keep Iran in check if it had access to a nuclear bomb. So the question I have is, aside from the current nuclear deal, at this time, are you aware of any alternative binding diplomatic agreement that would prevent Iran from developing a nuclear weapon?
I am not, Senator. I would highlight, though, the one thing we all have to come to grips with is there is a sunset to the current JCPOA, and that needs to be addressed in the near term.
It certainly does. But for right now, it appears that the Iran deal is working. There is no viable alternative, and it sounds like we need to keep enforcing this deal to keep us all safe. I want to ask you another question, and that is about North Korea. You know, most of the time, the discussion centers on the role of China, but I want to ask about Russia's relationship, which is also critical to influencing the North Korean regime. Russia has completed a railroad linking the two countries. A ferry now operates between Russia and North Korea. Vladimir Putin wrote off 90% of North Korea's $11 billion debt to Russia. State Department estimates that North Korea sends about 20,000 workers to Russia annually, which produces foreign currency that Kim Jong-un desperately needs. And while we're trying to pull the international community together to try to persuade North Korea to stand down on nuclear weapons, reports emerged last week that fuel shipments between Russia and North Korea are increasing. So, General Dunford, I want to ask, beyond our existing sanctions and authorities, what more should we be doing to counter Russia's support for North Korea?
Senator, I do believe that the solution to what's going on with Russia and China is diplomatic at this point. And economic, to the degree that sanctions and second and third order sanctions can be implemented. I don't think there is, at this point, a military dimension to the challenge of getting better cooperation from Russia and China. But I do believe that the things that Secretary Tillerson has proposed to do and what Secretary Mnuchin has implemented over the past couple of months may be affecting the calculus of Russia and China, although I think we're a long way from determining whether or not the path we're on will result in peaceful denuclearization, which, of course, is what we all want to see.
So let me ask you, to put this question, though, in a larger frame. You know, Russia seems to intervene in a lot of places in opposition to the United States, Syria, Afghanistan, North Korea. Can you just say a word about how you see Putin's larger strategy here?
I think that there's very few places that I could look at in the world, Senator, where U.S. and Russian interests align. And I think in many cases what they're trying to do, if you start in Europe, their primary focus is to undermine the credibility of the NATO alliance. If you look across the Middle East, they're trying to undermine the partnerships that we have and erode the confidence in our partners of the U.S. commitment to the region. And I think by the same token, they're trying to play a spoiler role and achieve undue influence in the issue on the Korean Peninsula that you spoke about a minute ago. So I can't think of too many places where Russia is playing a helpful role right now, from the Maghreb to the Middle East to North Korea.
Yeah, I just think it's so critical as we talk about our alliances around the world that we recognize exactly this point, that Russia's doing everything it can to break up those alliances, to sow discord in those alliances, and the importance of our keeping them together, and the importance of holding Russia accountable for what it's doing with North Korea.
Senator, if I could just make a quick comment on that.
Please.
I mean, when we developed the national military strategy that we have right now, we determined that the strength of the U.S. military was our allies and partners in a network we built up since World War II. Not only Russia, but others recognize that that's our source of strength, and so there's a concerted effort to undermine those allies and partners. And so what we should be doing at this point is doubling down our efforts to maintain strong alliances and partnerships, because that is the key to success.
Good. Thank you very much, General.
On behalf of Chairman McCain, Senator Sullivan, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and General, congratulations to you, sir, and your family. For your decades of exceptional service. I look forward to supporting your swift reconfirmation. I wanted to turn to an issue that you and I have talked a lot about in the NDAA. I had a provision in there this year that talked about our FONOPS policy and how we should be looking at regular routine and, if possible, with allies. So in some ways, our FONOPs, particularly in the South China Sea, are no longer newsworthy. Can you elaborate a bit on the department's FONOPs policy and if this differs from the previous administration? For example, you know, it was reported that Admiral Harris essentially had to get individual FONOPs approved by the NSC one at a time under the Obama administration. What's the strategy right now under the Trump administration, and how does that differ?
No, Senator, thanks. That is a good question. Secretary Mattis, when he came in early February, we went to him with a couple of individual freedom of navigation operations that you spoke about. And he said, hey, look, how about give me a full strategy that lays this thing out now for a long period of time and talks about the strategic effect we're trying to achieve. You spoke about partners. You talk about being routine and regular. And so those are the things that Secretary Mattis directed. After that, Admiral Harris developed a long-term plan for freedom of navigation operations, and that's what we're implementing right now as a strategic approach to freedom of navigation operations that does, in fact, support our overall strategy in the Pacific as well as the specific mission, which is to ensure that we fly, sail, and operate wherever international law allows, and we continue to validate those claims where we see international airspace, for that matter, or the maritime domain.
So those are going well, regular, routine, with our allies, if possible, not micromanaged from the NSC?
That's right. And Senator, in candor, we still and always will take into account what else is happening in the strategic environment, whether it's a UN General Assembly or some other event. But we do have a base plan from which we're operating right now in a healthy dialogue, I believe, between the commander and the Secretary of Defense.
Let me turn to missile defense. You've had a lot of questions today. I think is it safe to say that the administration views a much more robust missile defense as a key part of our strategy with regard to North Korea or Iran? With regard to rogue nations like those two countries that are trying to acquire intercontinental ballistic nuclear missiles?
No question, Senator.
So you mentioned the NDAA does a lot. We do, but I think there's more that we should be doing. Does the administration have plans to, at least from a supplemental perspective or working with the Congress, beefing up our missile defense? I think it's something we all agree, it's very bipartisan, by the way, that we need to be doing. What are more specifics, General, you could share with us on what we need to be doing, and how can Congress support you?
Sure, Senator, we did do exactly as you suggest, and we've submitted it. And if you don't have a copy of that, I'll make sure you get one. But we looked at additional radar systems. We looked at THAAD systems, Patriot systems. As you know, in the NDAA, there's additional interceptors, additional 21, I think is the number that I recall, that are in there. All of those issues are part of it. We did an immediate kind of supplemental, for, just as your suggestion, for ballistic missile defense. I think it was maybe the first or second week of August to make sure it was in time for the budget cycle. So I think what you have outlined in the NDAA, combined with the supplemental that the administration has put together, will meet the immediate needs. But of course, we need a long-term strategic approach to ballistic missile defense, and buying the same capabilities that we have today into the future is not going to be the solution as the threat adapts. And I know you've received some of the classified briefings on the adaptations of the threat, which means our ballistic missile defense capabilities also have to adapt.
Well, we want to work with you on that. I think it's an area, like I said, of bipartisan cooperation in the Congress, which is new but important development, and we want to work with the administration on that. Let me end just a final question. I really want to applaud you and General Mattis, the entire administration, Secretary Tillerson, on the North Korea strategy. I think what you're trying to achieve, your focus on it, importantly, your frequent and constructive engagement with Congress, asking us to play our part, have also been very, very an important element of that strategy. I also believe that you talk a lot about credible military options, and that, to me, is an effective element of our diplomacy. Effective diplomacy, which I think we're starting to see a lot of progress in that realm. If one of the options was a preemptive or preventive ground war on the Korean Peninsula, like the Gulf War in 1990 or 2003 that was launched by the U.S., my view is that would require an AUMF from the Congress, and constitutionally and politically this would help our policy with regard to leverage, with regard to the ability to show the world that the American people were behind that. Do you agree with that? And is that something that the administration has started to talk about? I've raised it with a number of folks. I think it's an important issue. We want to be supportive. I think you're getting bipartisan support for what the strategy is, but that kind of issue to me is something that we need to be prepared to discuss. Do you have a view on that, General?
Senator, I think what I'd do is probably narrow my view to the scenario you're describing. I would want to have the full-throated support of the American people in the form of the Congress if we did something like you're suggesting.
Right, and I use that language very carefully. I know the President has a lot of authority to react, to take action, particularly if we're attacked, but I'm talking about a ground war a la 1950, launched by the United States, although in 1950, as you know, there was no congressional authorization. I think that's an important topic. I think it gives us leverage, and I'm glad to see that you believe that for something like that, you would want that. And I don't want to put words in your mouth.
No,
it's an important
Senator,
issue.
I think again, we know from history that we are going to be much better degree of success if we have the full-throated support of the American people when we go to war. What you're suggesting is going to war. And, and if we're going to conduct a major war, then having the full support of the American people in the form of the Congress, I think, is something we need to have.
Thank you. Thank you, General.
On behalf of Chairman McCain, Senator Nelson.
General Mattis, General Dunford, you have certainly my confidence in you. And the reason I said General Mattis, I also have that confidence in General Mattis, and I also have that confidence in General Kelly. Is there something about Marines that inspires confidence?
Senator, in my current assignment, I don't think you want me to answer that question, do you?
No.
Thank you, sir.
Vladimir Putin cannot beat us on land. He can't beat us on the sea. He can't beat us under the sea. He can't beat us in the air. And he can't beat us in space. But he can beat us in cyber. You want to comment on that, how our forces are organized to deter and counter?
Thanks, Senator. I mean, I would agree with your assessment that the most significant threat in cyberspace we face today, the most advanced capabilities are the Russians. That's our assessment. I would argue, though, that it's not only his cyber capability. The one thing that the Russians have effectively done is combine that cyber capability with political influence operations, economic coercion, information operations, electronic warfare, and even military posture. And if you take those 4 or 5 things and you look at the centralized command and control system that Russia has, even playing an overall weak hand, as you've described each of the domains where we have dominance, even with an overall weak hand, they've been able to effectively advance their interests without going to war. And I do believe that that's an area that not only should we be focused on in the department, and our recent global campaign plans now have added what I call competition, adversarial competition, short of armed conflict as being an area that is included in our campaign plans. But I also believe we need to take a look at that from a whole of government perspective as well in order to be competitive.
Absolutely. Because you know what he can do in the next election. He doesn't, and the newspapers have reported that he's already in several states' registration records. All he has to do is particular critical precincts go in and eliminate every 10th voter. You can imagine the chaos that would occur on Election Day if the voters get there and, I'm sorry, Mr. Jones, you're not registered. That would be significantly disruptive to our infrastructure and to the underpinnings of our country, a free and fair election. the president's budget makes significant funding cuts in the Department of State and USAID. Does that make sense to you?
What I can say is, Senator, that there's no challenge that I'm currently dealing with that the primary factors in our success won't be diplomatic, economic, and certainly even in our campaign in Iraq and Syria, USAID plays a critical role in stabilization to secure the gains that our partners are making on the ground in Syria and Iraq as one example. But every place I've been over the past 15 or 16 years in Iraq and Afghanistan, a key partner has been USAID.
Well, and as you all, as military commanders, you also project American power in the forms of using so many of our other agencies of government, so that you become not only a warrior as a military commander, you become a diplomat as well, utilizing those other levers of power. We've seen that used very effectively by your respective commanders in Africa, likewise again in Latin America. And if you don't have those other agencies, and I just mentioned two, state and USAID, it clearly clips your wings in being able to function as a military commander. Any further comment on that?
Senator, I think I'd probably just reinforce the one point that today any of our military commanders to be successful have got to achieve unity of effort with the other government agencies that are on the ground. And you mentioned two, but if I think of our Afghanistan experience, the FBI was there, the DEA was there, Customs Border Police was there. So I agree with the thesis that the challenges that we face today are complex contingencies, and they require elements of all of our government in order to be successful. And so trying to draw a distinction between the security of our nation in one department is not possible today. Many departments in our government are all involved in the fundamental task of government, which is security.
And General, thank you also to your family for the sacrifices that they have made over the years and allowing him to continue to serve his country, and for you all continuing to serve the country in the role that you have, which is substantial. Thank you.
On behalf of Chairman McCain, Senator Graham, please.
Thank you, General Dunford, for your service. Why should I vote for you?
Senator, over the past 2 years, I think I have provided best military advice.
Okay, you've got me. In the next 2 years, don't you agree that sequestration needs to be fixed, or we're going to go backwards?
It does, Senator.
Do you agree with me if you don't reform entitlements over the arc of time, there's no money left to do anything other than entitlements?
Senator, I've seen the math, and we're headed towards a situation where it's going to be very difficult.
Yeah, so entitlement reform is necessary to keep a strong military. I want to look at the threats going forward in the next 2 years. Do you agree that there must be a credible military option on the table when it comes to North Korea?
I do, Senator, and I've personally conveyed that to our to China and to our allies in the region.
Do you agree with me that Iran has taken the money from the Iranian nuclear agreement and done more damage with it than good?
There are indicators that some money that was freed up as a result of JCPOA has been put back into malign activities, and certainly I'd be hard-pressed to find anything that Iran does that is good.
So the goal of the agreement was to get them back into the family of nations. Would you say thus far that has not been achieved?
Iran is not part of the family of nations today, Senator.
Okay. Syria. Do you agree with me that if we leave Assad in power, it's going to be very difficult to end this war?
Senator, I've looked at Syria, as you can imagine, pretty hard, and I think addressing the grievances of the civil war are going to be necessary to have a stable political construct.
Okay. In terms of Russia, over the last 6 months, have they gotten better, worse, or about the same?
In Syria, Senator?
Anywhere? Everywhere?
They certainly haven't gotten any better anywhere.
Okay. There may be evidence that Russia was more deeply involved in sending out fake news during our last election. Does that trouble you?
It troubles me, Senator, although I don't have any unique insight into it.
Afghanistan, the recent decision to add more capability with rules of engagement changes, do you think that is necessary to be continued?
I think it is necessary, Senator, and I think it will help to get the Afghan security forces to reverse the trends of the last 2 years, casualties and the lost ground that they have experienced. I think what this additional effort will allow us to do is provide more effective advisory effort down to the tactical level with the Afghans, and also better leverage the air support that we have, and we have increased the air support as well.
And there's a new emphasis on Pakistan where they need to be a better part of the team?
That's exactly right, Senator. There's a key assumption in in the President's South Asia strategy that Pakistan cannot continue to be a sanctuary for Haqqani, Taliban, and others, and we have success.
Would you agree with me that we have to have very skilled ambassadors representing our country in both Pakistan, Afghanistan, and India to get a good outcome militarily?
I would agree, Senator, and I was very encouraged, and I think you were on a committee that we confirmed Ambassador Bass to go to Afghanistan. I've got a good experience with him in Turkey. I've watched him deal with difficult situations, so I think we have the right man headed to Afghanistan.
So in Iraq, it's just a matter of time. Do we clear ISIL out of Iraq? Do you agree with that?
I believe the Iraqi security forces are on a pretty good trajectory right now to clear out ISIS.
As you look forward in Iraq, if the Iraqis would accept a follow-on force, do you believe it is our national security interest this time to leave some troops behind to continue to work with the Iraqis?
I do, Senator. I think there's a large recognition, both in Iraq and certainly for the coalition partners that are there, that continued training of the Iraqi security forces is going to be necessary for them to become self-sustaining. Obviously, the decision is going to have to be a political decision between the Iraqi government and the U.S. government, but from a military perspective, I certainly believe that that's necessary.
And finally, do you agree if the world is seen as capitulating to Kim Jong-un, the United States, but the world at large, that the Iranians will watch and have a different view of where they should be going?
Well, I think all the nations that I would consider adversaries or potential adversaries will watch closely what's happening on the Korean Peninsula.
And finally, it's the policy of this administration to deny the North Korean regime the ability to develop an ICBM with a nuclear weapon on top to hit the American homeland, not contain it, but deny it. Is that correct?
That is the articulated policy of President Trump.
Do you agree with
Senator.
that policy?
I do, Senator.
Thank you, and I look forward to your service for the next 2 years. Our men and women in the military could not be in finer hands. Thank you and your family.
Thank you, Senator.
On behalf of Chairman McCain, let me recognize Senator Blumenthal.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. General Dunford, first of all, thank you for your service and to your family as well. I would like to focus just briefly on Puerto Rico. You were asked about it earlier. Is there more that the Department of Defense can do to provide assistance in the midst of this humanitarian crisis, which involves not only human suffering, but also the interruption for some period of time of communications, of travel, logistics, the lifeblood in terms of infrastructure of the island? Is there more that the military can do?
Senator, if there is, we'll be doing it. We're in a constant, first of all, I couldn't agree with you more, and we've watched the tragedy unfold here over the last few days. The last update I had, not just to come over here, but just because that's how constant we're getting updated, was an update on our efforts in Puerto Rico. To date, what they've identified are the things that would allow us to open the airfields, open the ports, and get that immediate electricity, fresh water, and food to the people in Puerto Rico. But if there is more that needs to be done, I can assure you that Secretary Mattis has placed Puerto Rico as a priority for all of us, and General Robinson is in constant contact with FEMA as well as officials in Puerto Rico to make sure the department is leaning forward and providing all the support that they need.
The National Guard of Connecticut, and I think of other states, have been involved in transportation. The airfields are now open to military aircraft and relief flights. Do you anticipate that military aircraft can and will be used more extensively in this effort?
I do, Senator. That's absolutely part of the plan, particularly, again, for generators, water, food, those kind of immediate needs.
Would you anticipate that the Corps of Engineers can play a role in opening some of the ports, perhaps some of the other means of transportation that could be involved?
Senator, I don't know whether it be specifically the Corps of Engineers or some of our combat engineers, but I do believe that the military is uniquely capable of helping to clear the debris and get the airfields, repair the airfields and get them up and operating. And I can assure you, whatever capabilities are required in that regard, whether they're resident inside the Corps of Engineers or resident in some of our other operational units, will make sure that the right capability is at the right place.
And the Department of Defense is indeed leaning forward and prepared, ready, able, and willing to provide whatever assistance is necessary.
Absolutely, Senator. These are Americans, and we're going to do everything we can to help them out.
And they are Americans.
They are Americans, Senator.
Let me ask you about the recent exercises conducted by Russia. I think they were called Zapad, Zapad West with Belarus. Are there any sort of lessons or other intelligence that we've gained that you can discuss in this forum from having observed those exercises?
Senator, probably be, if you don't mind, reluctant to discuss it in public. I was just with a meeting of all 29 NATO chiefs of defense last weekend. This, as you can imagine, was one of the topics. And then I came back out through Norway with my Norwegian counterpart to talk more specifically about challenges on the northern flank of NATO and some of the things we've seen in the exercise. But I can assure you, we watch very carefully what the Russians have done during Operation Zapad to make sure that we understand where they are in terms of capability development and what the implications are for NATO security and for U.S. security.
And despite the Russian efforts to drive wedges in our NATO alliance among our allies, would you say that the NATO alliance is in good health right now?
Senator, I would, and I certainly now have probably a 5-year perspective from 2 out of my last 3 assignments directly involved with NATO. And I would even say in the last year, a year ago, there was a strong debate inside of NATO about 360-degree security and almost a different view from those nations that viewed the South and the terrorist threat as being the priority, and those nations that viewed Russia as being a priority. And I think over the past year with some very strong leadership, and I think the Secretary General has been a part of that, I feel much better today about the cohesiveness of NATO and about the recognition that it's not either or of those threats, it's both, and that nations need to make the significant contributions to prepare us for both of those challenges. So I think the overall health of NATO is actually, I would assess to be very strong.
Thank you. My time has expired, but I just want to say I will be strongly and enthusiastically supporting you for another term. And again, my thanks for your service and as well to your family. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator.
On behalf of Chairman McCain, Senator Shaheen, please.
Well, thank you. I think I'm the last one, so hopefully we will be quick. General Dunford, thank you to you and your family for your willingness to continue to serve in this role. I think it's fair to say that there's a lot of support on this committee for your nomination. On Friday, it was reported that the KC-46 aerial refueling tanker program was hit with 3 Category 1 deficiencies, including one that was reported as possibly jeopardizing the willingness of the Air Force to accept the aircraft from Boeing. How concerned are you about those deficiencies, and are you worried that we won't be able to take delivery of those aircraft by the scheduled time of spring of 2018?
Senator, what I am concerned about is the delivery of the tankers and the capability that would imply a capability gap. I think if you had the transportation commander here, General McDough, today, he would talk to you about tankers as being one of his more significant challenges in meeting all of our requirements. So I'm not familiar with the details of these deficiencies, and it hasn't been translated into time for me at this point. But I think with regard to the capability itself, that is one of the more critical capabilities in a joint force, and all of our plans are based on our ability to meet this requirement.
Well, absolutely, and I'm sure, I assume you would give us your commitment that you will follow up and find out how serious those deficiencies are and whether they jeopardize the scheduled time frame for delivery.
I will, Senator.
Thank you. You talked about the importance of electronic warfare and of coordinating those efforts, and also there have been several back and forths about Russia and its hybrid capabilities and how important that is to its current capacity to engage. Can you talk about how the military is looking at our electronic and cyber tools and how we're working with other departments within the federal government, Treasury, State, to coordinate those efforts?
Right. Senator, obviously primarily focused on defending the information technology of the department as well as select industrial pieces that support the department. So that's our primary focus. And then defending the nation, which includes a suite of offensive capabilities. So being able to exploit in cyberspace, being able to conduct offensive operations and defensive operations are all a piece of it. But with regard to collaboration and cooperation, the one area that Admiral Rogers and his team are very focused on is when a vulnerability is identified, the sharing and the action taken to address those vulnerabilities is an important piece. And that's going to require not only, as you suggest, great cooperation within the government, and I think we're in a pretty good place in that regard, but it's also going to require great public-private cooperation as well, so that when that assistance is offered, it's accepted and there's a degree of trust that what we're trying to do is actually help them mitigate the risk of vulnerabilities. That's probably one of the key areas of cooperation. And as you know, Senator, you've paid close attention to this issue. There's always a debate about what agency within our government is best capable of performing what mission. I think that dialogue will go on for many years to come, and we're always refining it, and we should be. We shouldn't be comfortable or complacent that we have it exactly right, and that dialogue is ongoing, not only about the organizational construct of Cyber Command itself, but also the department's role within the broader government effort.
I certainly agree with that. However, I do think it's important for us to have someone within the administration who is the point person on cyber activities. Is there somebody that you're aware of who's actually the person in charge of those activities?
Senator, I can't say that there is. It doesn't mean that there isn't. I'm not aware of somebody right now in the administration who's designated. I probably and incorrectly have a decidedly DOD perspective right now, but I'll certainly find out.
Well, thank you. I think it says something that, as the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, you're not aware of who the person is who's in charge. You also talked about the importance of our alliances and partnerships and how that contributes to how Russia and our other adversaries view the strength of the United States. Do you have any sense of what the reaction would be among our partners with the JCPOA if the United States were to abrogate our commitments under that treaty?
Senator, I don't have any unique insights into that, but I certainly know what everybody else knows from the open source, and I don't think there'd be unanimity of those who were part of the JCPOA were we to walk away.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and again, thank you for your willingness to continue to serve.
Thanks, sir.
Thank you. On behalf of Chairman McCain, Senator Peters, please.
Thank you, Senator Reid. General Dunford, again, thank you for your testimony here today. Thank you for your service to our country. But I also just want to thank you for your thorough answers that you always give to our questions. They're very candid, and not only your willingness to answer those questions here in a formal setting, but you've always been accessible to us on a one-on-one basis to answer specific questions, and I appreciate that immensely. General Dunford, I know that the Department is concerned about the geopolitical implications of mega cities, including the growth of cities of over 10 million people. I spoke with Admiral Harris about this when he testified earlier this year. Admiral Harris testified that there are 10 megacities in the world, with 8 of them in the Pacific Command area of responsibilities. And these locations are ripe to become geopolitical hotspots, given the number of people involved and some of the unique political context that they are associated with them. So the ability of the services to operate in these very dense urban environments are going to become increasingly important, both in contingency and conflict as well as humanitarian assistance. We have particular concerns about Seoul, given the threats of that are now associated with North Koreans' action, and Seoul is obviously one of those mega cities that we need to be concerned about, and also raises a host of other issues when it comes to dealing with that. If you could address plans that we have for dealing in mega cities, how you plan to deal with that issue, and are there needs for us to invest additional training and not only of the soldiers and Marines, but also developing tactics and procedures that we need to go forward that we should be assisting you in from a congressional perspective?
Senator, I could, and I think the core of what we're doing to prepare for that is found in our exercise, in our experimentation program, and it also reflects in the priorities that we'd have for innovation. And so if you take a look at our exercise and experimentation program, it is focused on our ability to deal in a very complex, dense urban terrain. I think all of us have looked at the demographics. We looked at where people will live. We looked at where the sources of conflict will be, and in preparing ourselves accordingly to do that. There's some unique challenges in mega cities. Command and control is one of those challenges. Intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance is one of those challenges. Minimizing collateral damage while delivering effective fires are one of those challenges, and those are all areas within the department that we are working on.
And please let us know if there's anything else we can do to help you provide the resources necessary, because I think it's obvious that's going to be an area that we're going to have to be dealing with in the future without question.
Thanks, Senator.
When you were asked a previous question about things not to assume in a future war, at the top of the list was our ability to dominate in space. And so I'd like you to talk a little bit about that, and in particular what we're seeing with the Chinese that seem to be developing. At least evidence suggests that they're developing as many as 3 different ASAT capabilities and have conducted multiple tests in space of direct ascent ASAT systems. They also established a new service a few years ago to make that capability even more robust. You could address how concerned we should be, and from a congressional perspective, do we need to be putting more resources into this critical area?
Senator, thanks. When we fielded the current space capabilities, we didn't field them with resilience to the current threat in mind. And so they are vulnerable to the threats that you spoke about. And not only the Chinese, but the Russians and others recognize that. Even North Korea has a nascent anti-space program that's there. And if you look at our dependencies in space, whether it's the timing of our systems, global prepositioning, our command and control systems militarily, or the dependence on our economy on space capabilities, the vulnerabilities in space, which we really identify in the budget as a need for increased resilience in space to those threats, the vulnerabilities have significant implications, not only from a military perspective, but from a commercial perspective as well. So certainly part of our budget is designed to enhance our resilience in space and also enhance the redundancies and the access that we have to a wide range of space capabilities so that we minimize the threat that you've identified. As a result of that analysis and recognition, probably the last 3 years, you have seen increased requests from the department for space-related capabilities. Again, my priority at this point would be on space resilience, but there's a wide range of other capabilities we need as well. And that, again, is informed by the developing threat, military threat to space capabilities that we have.
And if I may add, the point that you made, it's not just our military satellites. We need to be working with some of our commercial suppliers of communication satellites and other space technologies. We should be stepping up our activities working with the commercial sector, I would assume?
Absolutely, Senator. In fact, one of the areas that we believe there's some potential is to better leverage commercial activities, for example, to expand our intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance capability.
Great. Thank you, General. Appreciate it.
General, thank you for your service, selfless service to the Marine Corps and to the nation, and thank your family for their service alongside you. And on behalf of Chairman McCain, I would declare the hearing adjourned. Thank you.
Hey, thank you, Senator.